Empower Black men to live extraordinary lives. Shatter the stereotypes. Power Black men, shatter the stereotypes. Power Black men to live extraordinary lives. Shatter the stereotypes. Shatter the stereotypes. Power Black men to live extraordinary lives.
Welcome to Shatter the Stereotypes, where the intention is to empower Black men to live extraordinary lives. This show is based on the simple idea that every Black man is capable of creating inner peace, dynamic health, great relationships, and financial abundance. Therefore, we provide insights and strategies to educate, motivate, and inspire Black men to reach their full potential and create the life of their dreams. So if you're ready for some high-octane motivation and inspiration that supports and empowers you to live the life you were born to live, get ready to shatter the stereotypes so you can build a life that lights you up and positively impacts the world. So now, let's shatter the stereotypes with your host, Coach Michael Taylor.
Hello and welcome to Shatter the Stereotypes, where the intention is to empower Black men to live extraordinary lives. I have come to know that the three most difficult words for any man to say is, I need help. And the reason it's so difficult is because our current masculine culture has conditioned men to believe that asking for help is a sign of weakness. And so the time has come for us as men to recognize that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength. It takes an incredible amount of strength and courage to say, I need help. And when a man chooses to ask for help, he opens the door to change his life for the better. To help remove the stigma and fear about asking for help, I've brought in a special guest who is going to make this conversation a little easier and to answer some questions about therapy and seeking support. Her name is Dr. Ebony Butler, and she is a psychologist and coach who has committed her life to supporting men and women in their personal healing and transformation. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Butler to the show. Hello, Dr. Ebony, how are you?
I'm well. Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for having me.
All righty. Well, I'm really excited to have you on the show because this show is about transformation for men.
Yeah.
And if you're a guy, you go, wait a minute, she's a woman.
Yeah, I am.
well, guess what? We can learn from women. And it's important for us, especially in the Black community, to heal this strife that we sometimes have between Black men and women. And that's what this conversation is about. It's about healing our communities, creating great relationships, and understanding that we can learn from each other. So, Dr. Ebony, I'm really excited to have you on the show. And before we start talking about therapy, though, I just want to kind of do a little icebreaker session here. So, first of all, tell us where you're from. And tell us a little bit about growing up, say during your high school years. What was that like for you?
So I'm from Mississippi, originally Jackson, Mississippi. And high school was probably one of my most memorable times in my life. So I'll go back. So I'm a psychologist here in Austin now. And I particularly work around trauma recovery. And as a coach, I do a lot of food relationship coaching to help us try to understand our relationship with food a little bit better. And so growing up, high school was fun as high school can be, because I think I was coming into myself, trying to learn myself, trying to figure out where I fit in the world. But it was one of the most enjoyable times of my life. I always say, if I can go back to any time, it would be high school. I danced, I was in flag, I was in the band, I was always involved with something. I played basketball. I was just always involved, and I loved every minute of it because I felt like at that time, there wasn't a lot of judgment. There wasn't a lot of people. I mean, kids are mean, but I felt well received. I felt accepted. I felt comfortable. And it wasn't until I actually got to college that I was like, oh, people don't really like me. I was like, oh, there are some people who don't like me. That's new for me because I've never experienced that. So it was cool. And I was kind of in a program where it was for college prep classes and things like that. And it was still very fun. And I learned a lot about myself. I think that those core skills and things I learned at that time still hold true and have helped me to get where I am today. Nice. It was actually, Michael, in high school where the first idea for me becoming a psychologist was planted.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about your family. What's sisters, brothers, husband,
Yeah,
kids?
I have an older sister and a younger brother. Those are my full sister. That's my full sister, my full brother. And I have two half siblings, a younger sister and a younger brother. I grew up with both my parents until I was like 11, and then they split. And so I was raised by a single woman, a single Black mom in Mississippi from there on out. And so I think that things were hard. Things were rough. My family was very tight knit, so I was also raised by my aunts and uncles and cousins and things like that. So we were always together and always spending time together, and it was still rough. But it taught me a lot about work. It taught me a lot about how I was going to like what I wanted for myself, relationship wise, what I wanted for myself, success wise, career wise, that kind of thing. And so I do think that that was also a very fundamental piece too, is actually just kind of seeing how the women and men in my family kind of like helped raise everybody's children. That was pretty cool. And I'm really close to my older sister, so we're 2 years apart. And so we talk every day. And so, we are very close. And I kind of denied that for a while. I was like, I'm not close to my sister. I got real friends. But we are really good friends. And I would consider her one of my best friends. And we talk every single day. So that's still good. And then I have a couple nieces on my brother's side.
Nice.
Mhm.
So name a book that you love and tell me why you love it.
The book that I love that I would recommend to anybody is The Four Agreements.
Ooh, one of my favorites.
I know. I love the Four Agreements. It's actually kept me sane a lot in my life. It kept me sane when I was in my residency. I was actually going through a divorce at that time, and I was like, the chapter on don't take things personal was so helpful. And helped me to regulate myself, helped me to put some things into perspective. And I recommend that book to all of my clients. So I love it. I read it a couple times. I read it at least once a year, but I go to that chapter a couple times a year.
Yeah, I've actually done a whole series on that book.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it's really powerful. Really
Yeah,
powerful.
I love it.
Now, if you love movies, name a favorite movie.
Oh, people might not like this, but one of my favorite movies is What's Love Got to Do with It? I used to have a friend who was like, why do you like that movie with so much violence? And I just love Tina Turner. And so I love that movie. And I think that I'm a huge Angela Bassett fan. And so I just loved, and I think she did so well in that movie. So that's one of my favorite movies.
And and the story of Tina Turner is so amazing, especially from a female perspective of gaining your power back, and taking responsibility for your life and moving through adversity. So I love it too. It's a really well done movie, and it's obviously based on a true story, which makes it even more intriguing. But very well done by Angela Bassett, who's just smoking hot.
Yeah, I love her. I love her so much. I think my top favorites are her, Oprah, and Whitney Houston. I love them so much. Yeah.
Nice. Now, if I gave you a magic wand, and with this magic wand, you could create anything your heart desired, what would your life look like 10 years from now?
Ooh, that's such a good question because I already know. I would be living somewhere in like Bali, and I would be traveling the world and doing what I love. Like I would still be doing this work from all locations in the world that I ever wanted to be. So my vision has always been to have a virtual group practice where I can be anywhere in the world and still run a group practice and have employ other therapists, other healers, like energy healers or people who do body work, like massage therapists, that kind of thing, to employ them and have my company, the Center for Creating Change is the name of my company, be the one that kind of goes out and finds them clients. Of course, they'd be working wherever they want to be, wherever they're located. But I would be the person who kind of like brought clients to them, and clients would kind of go through and have the option to kind of do a broad range of treatment and healing work with the people who are involved in that practice. So instead of a brick and mortar, I wanted something that would be virtual where we could still all work from different locations in the world, still providing clients the same services, but I would be somewhere traveling the world doing that.
Now, that's a very powerful vision that I'm absolutely certain you can pull off.
I'm gonna do it. I don't know when and how, but it's gonna happen.
I have absolutely no doubt. So now, again, you introduce yourself as a psychologist, but give us that professional resume, if you will, of your work.
Yeah, so I graduated in 2012, and I did an internship in New Orleans at the New Orleans VA. So a lot of my background and training comes from the Veterans Affairs system. And I did 2 years postdoc residency in San Diego. And I worked down in the Valley, Harlingen, McAllen area for 2 years at the VA down there. And now I actually have a full-time job now too, where I currently work for first responders, firefighters, and EMS. Trauma work. So my area of specialty is trauma work. So I still do that. And then I have a private practice where I work specifically with people of color, Black women, around recovery, around trauma, interpersonal trauma, and racial trauma, identity development, and confidence building, empowerment, that kind of thing. So that's my psychologist side of things. And I do consulting, I do speaking around self-care, racism, workplace trauma, that kind of thing. And then I do food relationship coaching, where I help people not focus on weight so much, but focus on how to feel empowered in their food choices, how to get back to trusting their bodies, how to get back and listening to themselves. Because if you know anything about trauma, it completely disconnects us from our bodies, and it disconnects the mind-body kind of connection, where we begin to say, oh, I feel full, or I feel like this is too much, or I feel like I want more. Those kinds of things are completely kind of like gone for some people. And I help to kind of like help us regulate and get back to that on that side of things. So it's not really about weight loss or working out or anything like that. It's how do you get back to trusting your body to do what you want it to do, and to kind of feel centered and grounded in your body without so much shame, guilt, and anxiety.
Yeah, and that goes back to the saying that it's normally not what you're eating, but what's eating you.
Yeah, absolutely.
That causes the dysfunction in your life. And being willing to look at what's eating you helps you change your relationship with food.
Absolutely. It's always a root, and we're always trying to figure out the why, like where these messages come from. What messages are you holding on to? I remember being told that if you don't eat all your food, the kids in Africa are going to starve. And I was like, well, wait a second. If I eat the food, aren't the kids in Africa still going to starve? So I'm not really quite sure what but we hold that to still be true as adults, right? So helping us to unlearn a lot of that stuff too.
Yeah. Now, a lot of people are going to ask, when you think about therapists, so you have psychologists, you have psychiatrists, you have psychotherapists, you have all these different labels. Can you kind of give a distinction between those?
Yes. So psychiatrists are medical doctors. Psychiatrists go to medical school. They are no different than a foot doctor, a heart surgeon, your primary care physician. They just have a specialty in psychiatric disorders and psychiatric medication. So their main focus, and they do rotations around medicine for mental illness and psychiatric conditions. But they're medical doctors nonetheless. They don't go to school to be therapists. They go to school to be medical doctors. And so psychologists, we go to school to understand theory, to understand ideology, to understand concepts, to understand how to apply that to the mental illness to help us figure out what's going on so that we can begin to work through it. So we are PhDs, and medical doctors are MDs. Psychiatrists are MDs. Then you have your master's level clinicians too. That's going to be like your licensed clinical social worker. That's going to be like your licensed marriage and family therapist, or your licensed professional counselor, which is the LPC. So those are all master's level. At the master's level, you're going to school probably 1.5 to 2 years worth of school, and you do some field work in that. With psychology, when you get the PhD, you're going to school for 4 to 6 years, and you have 1 to 2 years outside of that of residency. So the PhD route is a lot more comparable to the psychiatrist route in the amount of training that we receive. Now, master's level clinicians and psychologists, we're all psychotherapists.
Okay.
So we're all psychotherapists. Our disciplines and where we got our degrees are all different. So we can all identify as therapists and counselors. Psychotherapy, though, is rooted in the kind of like the beginning stages of therapy. That's like an old term, where psychotherapy is psychoanalyzing, all of that stuff. But it depends on kind of like where you see yourself in your orientation, your theoretical perspective, whether you call yourself a psychotherapist, a counselor, or a therapist. I refer to myself as a therapist and psychologist most.
Nice. Great distinction. Thank you for clearing that up, because that's the question that kind of goes through my head.
Yeah, because a lot of people, Michael, you're no different. A lot of people will go to a psychiatrist and say, well, they only spent 15 minutes with me. They didn't talk to me about any of my problems. They just wanted to give me medication. As that's what their job is. Right. It's like when you go to the doctor and you have a stomach ache, they give you something to remedy that stomach ache. That's the same thing as a psychiatrist.
Gotcha. Now, obviously, there's a lot of negative stigma surrounding men in therapy. But I've noticed that I believe there's a trend that's happening, because there's a lot of talk about mental health these days that, again, is bringing awareness to the importance of dealing with our inner stuff, I'll call it. So do you think attitudes are actually changing in your perspective?
Absolutely. They're changing slowly, slowly.
Slowly.
And they're changing, right? So we are becoming a lot more open to the idea of talking to somebody. The conversations are being had a lot more frequently than in the past around disclosing our inner stuff to a stranger, right? So with men, though, that conversation is a lot less frequent, a lot less loud. It's more so like women are, I would say women are taking the charge with going to therapy. And if we are more likely to tell the men, hey, you need to go to therapy, things like that. There are some men out there doing the work, charging the work, but it's slow coming. And so I don't want to say that men are not going to therapy. They absolutely are. Men are doing the work to kind of make it more of a conversation, make it more normal. But women are definitely a lot more ahead than men, and we all still have a long way to go. But the attitudes are changing. We don't see it so much as taboo as much as we did. We still do kind of see it as taboo, but we don't see it as much anymore.
Yeah, and that's the reason that I launched this platform, especially for Black men, to make it okay and to make it safe to talk about the things that we unfortunately are afraid to talk about sometimes. And so I've seen over the last several years a huge surge in men being open and willing to talk about, issues, trauma, emotional healing, and so forth. And I'm a firm believer in science, and I believe in human evolution. And I believe personally that human beings are still evolving, and we're beginning to wake up. And collectively as a species, we're waking up. But I think more than, anything, as for Black folk, with all the trauma that we see throughout the media, the George Floyds and all of that, I think there's a hunger for healing. I think there's a hunger for solutions. And rather than point fingers and place blame, what I try to do with this show is to bring people on that can provide some ideas, some wisdom that can be part of the solution. And that's what this whole intention is for this show, to bring about solutions and change. Because I'm an optimist. That's the lens through which I see the world. And I'm pretty optimistic about the future, especially for Black men, despite all we see throughout the media. So I want to talk about the big D word, and that's called denial. And so it is denial that keeps us stuck. It's that denial that keeps us from wanting to change and transform and keep us from going to therapy. So how would you explain denial to someone that may be listening to this?
I can't explain denial without talking about the historical context of denial, right? So Black men, Black boys are socialized to not need help. They're socialized to be providers, hunters and gatherers, would you say, like even back in the day, right? So there's no room for the level of vulnerability that is required when you need to do your work. There's no room for that. When you are a provider and you are surviving, there's no room for vulnerability. So if you don't teach this in the socialization and upbringing of Black men and boys, then we can't just automatically expect them to be able to go there when they are adults, when they're Black men, right? So if all that I know is that I'm a provider, I'm strong, I'm supposed to be this, and I'm not supposed to show emotion, showing emotion is weakness or all of these things, if I start to feel anything that contradicts that, it benefits me to be in denial. It benefits me to avoid having that conversation because I get to keep my identity, I get to feel safe, and I get to feel secure. When I start inviting in that new information, then that means that I have to unlearn a lot of the other things that kept me safe prior to this moment. And for a lot of people, it is far more safe to engage in denial because I don't have to unlearn that stuff. Because then I got to go back and figure out what lie I was told, what things I may have missed out on. So denial from that perspective is actually really protective. And so I tell people, like, I don't think we're just walking around here not wanting to tap into the things that are going on with us. I think that we haven't been taught how to do that. And I think that in order to tap into that, you have to know how to sit with vulnerability. And how many of us as kids were taught how to sit with being vulnerable? I remember even myself as a Black girl growing up crying and then being told, if you keep crying, I'm going to give you something to cry about. So do I want to keep crying? No. Do I learn how to become hardened to that? Yes. So if I was told that as a Black girl, what do you think Black boys were told? So where is the coping skill that is required to deal with my stuff? So if I don't have the coping skill, I'm going to rely on the thing that feels most comfortable, most safe, and that's denial. So I'd rather say that's not me. I'd rather say I don't have anything going on, because that allows me to still stay firm in my identity and who I know myself to be. And I don't want to invite harm to myself, because if I open myself up to say that I don't have it together, then that may invite harm from other people, family members, whatever, so that's the way that I would talk about it.
Yeah, and it's ego defenses. A lot of people, when you think of ego, they think of it as a bad thing. I don't. I see ego as a good thing, because the ego's job is to protect us.
Yes.
Ego's job is to create defense mechanisms to keep us from harm.
Right.
And so when we've experienced any type of trauma, that ego defense is a form of protection.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a way of trying to minimize pain and trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we have to be willing to do, though, is to recognize that sometimes it's okay to let go and to trust others. And that's a really difficult thing, especially for men, because you mentioned, about the roles that we have as men. So I wrote a book called A New Conversation with Men.
Mm-hmm.
And in this book, I talk about that as men, we've been conditioned to believe that we have three primary responsibilities, which are called the 3 Ps: procreate, provide, and protect.
Mm-hmm.
Since the beginning of time, that's what men have been conditioned to believe that their responsibilities were, regardless of race. But unfortunately, we've been taught to procreate, provide, and protect, but we weren't taught how to connect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And ideally, what we want as men is connection. Unfortunately, a lot of us don't have the tools for that connection, because we've got all these defense mechanisms up that, in some form of denial, it's keeping us from getting what we really, really, really want, which is connection. And that's why we're having this conversation, because I want men to get to the point where they're okay with saying, I need help, and being willing to create those connections. So I have come to know that there are really only 2 things that'll cause a man to want to change. One is pain, and the other is what I call divine discontent, which is simply an inner feeling and a knowing that something's just not right. Something's just off. So from that perspective, when you think about those 2 things, in your experience, what drives men to want to change more?
I would definitely say it's the pain.
Absolutely.
It's the pain,
Yeah.
right? I haven't seen men so eager for help in the absence of pain. And I think there's 2 sides to that coin. While I think that it's commendable that they're asking for help when they're in pain, I do think that we wait until it's too late sometimes, and then that can be harmful towards us as well. That can wait until we're in crisis is not always the best thing. But I definitely will say, out of the men that I work with and things that I've seen, it's been pain, like the ending of relationships, or infidelity, or betrayal, or the loss of a kid, or because I work with first responders, right? It's a male dominated occupation. Relationships are the most central place for pain. And then there comes kids, and raising kids, losing kids, seeing kids die, that kind of thing, or career and achievement, masculinity, sexual functioning, those kinds of things. So all of those will fall under the umbrella of pain. So if I feel like there's pain that is threatening my masculinity or my manhood, I'm more likely to go seek help as well. And then there's other ways that they seek help to deal with that pain as well. And, some people will do, different things to kind of supplement steroids, all these things to supplement a weakness that they feel, to deal with the pain that they feel around the things that they feel like they have a deficit in. So I definitely see that.
Yeah. Now, with that being said, I want to talk about trauma.
Okay.
Because collectively, I think in some cases as a group, we don't address and talk about trauma. And there's so many different types of it. But I want you to just kind of speak to trauma and the impact that it has on our self-esteem?
Oh, absolutely. Trauma is anything that has completely shifted the way that you see the world, affected your ability to feel safe in this world, um, basically kind of threatening your person, your personal integrity. So those things that feel like, you're almost at death's door, those kinds of things. Trauma completely alters the way we see the world, we see ourselves. It completely alters the way our brain works. I use the example of having a file cabinet or a file drawer, right? So we neatly place things in this file cabinet. We go into a restaurant, we pull our restaurant behavior folder. We know we go in, if we're at a nice restaurant, we go into the hostess stand. We don't just go seat ourselves. When we sit down, they ask for water. We don't just go to the back and get our own water. We don't go to the back and make our own food. There's a set of rules that we have that operate in this way, right? So that's our folder. We pull it out, we put it back neatly in when we are done with the restaurant. We do the same thing for work, for movies, for classrooms, that kind of thing. What happens with trauma comes in and completely throws your file cabinet all over the place. So when the dust settles and the papers go back into their respective folders, you have papers that are in the wrong folders. So now you go into a restaurant and now you're like, oh, where's the exit? So now you got your crisis response paper in your restaurant folder because now you have pulled it out and this is the paper that you're going through to figure out how you respond. You got that at the movies. You got that in the relationship. So your relationship folder used to be all nice and neat, but now you got ulterior motives. You got crisis response. You got survival mechanisms. All those papers are now in that folder. So it's what we do in trauma recovery is working to clean those folders out and put things back in the place that they belong, because this is going to help you be more effective, right? And so think about George Floyd and all of us witnessing that, all of us being here to see that happen. That's a throwing up of our folders, right? So now I've had clients say, I don't even feel safe walking to the mailbox. Me seeing Breonna Taylor, I don't even feel safe just sleeping in my bed. Like anybody can call the police on me, right? And I can get killed. So those are my file folders being in different places. So now my home and the way I behave in my home folder is all kinds of mixed up with with trauma in ways that I would respond if I were in danger.
Oh, I love that. That just makes it easy to grasp. I mean, that's a beautiful, beautiful metaphor. Now, again, one of the things I think we don't talk about in our community is the impact of things like sexual abuse. As a survivor myself, I remember as a kid being molested by a friend of the family. And when I tried to tell someone, I was laughed at, my brother teased me. And so that created a whole series of dysfunctions for me that I had to be willing to heal and move through. And I know it may be difficult for us to talk about these things, but it's happening in our community a lot, and we don't talk about it.
Yeah.
So I think it's important that as we talk about trauma, we let go of this idea of it being a Black thing or a white thing. It's just trauma. Mm-hmm. And we need to be willing to deal with how it impacts us as human beings. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I hear a lot from Black folks is, well, my mom and my dad used to beat me and I turned out okay.
Yeah.
We hear that a lot, right? Yeah. Can you talk about how we're probably not okay if we experience those types of experiences as children?
Yeah, we're not okay.
Yeah.
We're not okay. You can't be okay with something like that. The people that you love inflicting pain on you, pain to the point where this is supposed to teach you a lesson, so it's repeatedly happening, right? There's a disconnect. Again, in order for us to make that make sense in our minds, we reconcile with, well, I turned out fine. And we have to begin to define, what does fine mean? You're still alive, but are you operating in survival mode? Do you find it hard to trust other people? Are you finding it hard to be in relationship with people? Are you finding it hard to kind of be in relationship with your own children? Are you having children? What are the things you say to yourself about your judgment? What are the messages that you've learned about yourself when it comes to when you mess up? Have you learned to beat yourself up when you mess up? Because most of us, if we were whipped, we've got whoopings, most of us learned that doing something resulted in pain. So now that we don't have the belt anymore because we're too old, we use our mind to whip us back into shape. We use judgments to whip us back into shape. So we're not fine because we're still using the same tactics to keep ourselves in line. So most of us will reconcile that we're fine because that is the only way that we can make it make sense in our minds what happened to us. Instead of going back and learning, saying that was not okay, that means you have to look at your parents in a different way, maybe. And so a lot of people can't do that.
Yeah, and there's a defense mechanism in that, in which I believe that when we experience that pain, it's the ego's way or the mind's way of protecting ourselves. So what we do is we begin rationalizing and analyzing in our heads so we don't feel that pain that's associated with that event. And so it's important that we understand that until we go back and heal some of those traumas, it shows up in different ways in our lives.
It's going to always show up.
Yeah, failed relationships. And I remember Jan Levon said something, I can't remember the exact quote, but she said something about you have to be willing to make peace with your past. And she said, you got to be willing to stick your hand in that wound and pull that pain out. And that is so important because too many times, and I did this for a while. I was in this new age, positive thinking mindset, everything's perfect, blah, blah, blah. And I was in complete denial of a lot of pain that I had in my life. And it wasn't until a friend of mine sort of slapped me upside the head and got me to understand that one of my defense mechanisms was being smart and analyzing everything and understanding and reading books and understanding, but I didn't know how to deal with the pain, the hurt. And that's something that we seldom talk about, how we need to release that pain, because if we don't, that pain stays trapped in our bodies. And I'm a huge fan of Eckhart Tolle. I don't know if you're familiar with Eckhart Tolle. And he says, as human beings, we have what he calls a pain body. And that pain body is that energetic part of ourselves that stores, if you will, pain. And if we've got trapped pain, again, we're going to have all sorts of dysfunctions in our lives. So we have to be willing to let go and heal that trauma. And that's what the whole process of seeking help and support is about. It's about learning how to release and let go of that energy that's still trapped in us, that negative, painful energy that's trapped in our bodies. And so with that being said, I want to talk about something that, from a male perspective, we really need to talk about, because after my divorce, I had a really difficult time creating relationships. And I noticed this amazing pattern. My relationships would last 3 to 4 weeks max. And then the women were all saying the same thing as they left. I care too much about you to stay in this relationship because you're emotionally unavailable. Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, it's a shut off. It's like a switch, right? When you think about a divorce, even if you wanted to get out of it, because I also experienced this myself too in my divorce, you kind of turn yourself, it's a pain. Even if you wanted it to end, the closing and loss of something, that's grief. It's a pain, right? And then if there was some betrayal infused in there, some disappointment, it makes the pain even greater. Who wants to walk right back into a similar situation and experience that pain? So a defense mechanism is for me to disconnect, for me to shut it off. And men are a lot easier to shut it off than women and compartmentalize, but that will show up. And being in another relationship is also triggering. So I want this, but seeing you, your body, being with another person who is similar to the last person where I felt pain, my initial response and my natural response is going to be to defend myself against that, because I don't want to walk right back into a situation where I'm going to be exposed again. So you show up, you go through the motions, and you do what you need to do, but the connection is never there. The deep connection that people seek in intimate relationships is hard to access anymore because you are so closed off, and you're more in it with your mind than with your heart and your emotions, right? And we think we're doing something right. We're like, well, I'm in it. I'm moving on. Your mind is trying to move on, but it takes those emotions a long, long time to catch up when you've experienced so much pain.
Yeah, and see, and that's something, again, as men, we don't talk about, is the whole thing of loss. When we lose something, that it creates a pain. And I know that when I went through my divorce, and I didn't know anything about this stuff, I was just sort of stuck in trying to go through life. But what I knew is that my life wasn't working, and I didn't know how to make it work. And so it was after those failed relationships that I received a miracle, basically, because I was having a conversation with a female friend of mine. And I was basically having a pity party after all these failed relationships. And I was telling her, I said, you women say you want a good man, and I'm a good man, and y'all keep leaving me, right? And she said this, Michael, if one person calls you a jackass, you probably shouldn't worry about it. But if two or more do, you might want to get a saddle. Yeah. Have you not noticed that you're the only common denominator in all of your relationships? And when she said that, something clicked. I had a light bulb moment. I went, oh my gosh, you're absolutely right. And it was from that moment on that I decided I was going to figure out why I was emotionally unavailable. And that's what started me on my inner journey of healing and growing and moving past that, because I knew that I wanted to be married. I knew that I wanted to create a great relationship. And I had friends that had great relationships, so I knew it was possible, but I had to be willing to do the work to get to that place where I could be emotionally available in relationship. And as a result of the work that I've done, I've been blissfully married for the past 19 years.
Oh, nice.
And just absolutely love my life and my wife and my kids. And so I'm a living testament for men that it's possible, but it takes work.
It takes work, and you had something that a lot of people don't know how to access. You had a level of insight that stopped you and said, well, wait a second. Whew. Okay, I hear that. Some people can't hear that, and they may be like, well, also the common denominator was that I keep choosing the same type of woman. Instead of saying, okay, well, let me take a look at myself. So you had access to a level of understanding of yourself, or even know-how, to even stop and say, well, wait, let me turn this around to myself. Some people never get there. Some people never get there, and they just keep repeating the same thing.
Yeah, and I call that grace. Yes. Because there was something in me that I can't explain that gave me the insight and awareness to be able to say that.
Yes.
And also it was my commitment to reading books. See, I had read and studied a lot of stuff, and it helped me, I think, in that moment, say, oh, start making some connections. Now, with that being said, I want to talk about something once again that a lot of Black men don't talk about, is depression. Now, after my divorce, losing everything, I went through divorce, bankruptcy, foreclosure, depression. I was homeless for 2 years, living out of a car. But after my divorce, it got so bad that I had two choices. It was get help or die. Now, fortunately, I didn't drink or do drugs, or I would have been checked out a long time ago. But I didn't even recognize that I was depressed. One night, I'm sitting up late because I'm too depressed to sleep, and I saw this commercial from this health center talking about depression. And I noticed that I had all of those symptoms. Once again, light bulb came on. I went, I need to look at that, whatever that was. Now, I was still in denial. Rather than go to therapy, I started reading books on depression. I started trying to figure it all out in my head, right? But then I got to the point where I couldn't figure it out anymore. I had to do something. And that's when I decided to go to therapy. So I want you to talk a little bit about depression. Talk to the men that are watching this. What is it, and how do we recognize it?
Yeah, depression is a cluster of symptoms that kind of we kind of look at to determine whether or not you are depressed. So I think about depression on a spectrum. So you got depressed, you got sad, depressed, then you got major depressive disorder. When people hear depressed, they automatically think you're on the most traumatic or the most dramatic end of the spectrum. And that's not necessarily true. Many of us will fluctuate between depression at any given moment in our lives. We lose somebody, we will experience some level of depression. We only get to major depression if these cluster of symptoms that I mentioned earlier are causing a significant amount of dysfunction in your life or distress. So you can't sleep. You are not eating. You are eating too much. Your sex drive has gone down. You're not interested in things that you used to be interested in. You're having thoughts of wanting to harm yourself or kill yourself. You're losing. You're having difficulties concentrating. You're sad more times than not. So all of these things, and we look at it as clinicians, and we say, how many of these symptoms are you experiencing? Then we can say, yes, you are experiencing some level of depression. So it can be a chemical thing, it's a physiological thing, it's a mental and emotional thing where your emotions just seem kind of like, I think that we operate here typically on baseline emotions. Depression, you're operating here, right? So if your symptoms, if your emotions are more here and you're finding it hard to experience the range of emotions that we have as humans, then yes, that's a sign that you may have something going on. And anxiety can look a lot like depression too. So anxiety and depression have a lot of symptoms that overlap. And so you got that worry, that constant like thinking and doom impending, and kind of like something bad is going to happen, or worried about the future, thinking about the past, that kind of thing. You can also see that in depression too, but it depends on which one of your symptoms are more prominent. You can also have something that is off balance in your brain. So a loss of serotonin production, a loss of dopamine production. And so that's where meds come in to help regulate some of that stuff. And so this is what it would look like. We stop taking showers. We stop wanting to clean the house, stop taking trash out, stop brushing our teeth, stop taking care of the things that we normally take care of. Checked out at work. You're completely unproductive at work. You're checked out around your family, those kinds of things. So this is just looks like a cluster of things that's going on for us to be able to say, yes, that's depression. And most of it is low mood and operating below your baseline.
Yeah, and again, for men, I want you to know, again, imagine losing everything.
Yes.
Imagine losing your house, your family, everything that you hold dear, and now you're there by yourself. That will lead to some sort of depression because of the loss that you've experienced. So if you're dealing with any of that, if you're dealing with loss, relationships, your kids, whatever, it's okay to say, I need help.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay to say, I can't figure this out on my own. It's okay to say, I can't do this by myself. Because one of the things that I did was I began isolating myself from people. I didn't have a social life. I'd go to work. And amazingly, at work, no one would have noticed that I was depressed. Because that was the only thing I had to feel good about myself with. So I could go to work and actually function at work very, very well. But when I left work and I went home, I'm sitting in a room all alone, depressed, confused, not knowing what to do next. Mm-hmm. And I started having fleeting thoughts of suicide. Mm-hmm. It's like, what's the point? I lost everything. Why should I keep going on? Why should I keep going on? Now, my saving grace were my kids. Mm-hmm. I loved my kids so much, I couldn't imagine the pain that I would have inflicted on them if I would have taken my own life. Yeah. And that really was probably the saving grace, mm-hmm. My love for my kids. So the point I want to make here, men, is that there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying I need help. Mm-hmm. It is not a sign of weakness. It is a pure sign of strength. And it takes a lot of courage to say it. Mm-hmm. But once you do, I can assure you, your life can change for the better. Mm-hmm. You don't have to go through life with this cloud over your head that, you can't get your life back on track, because you can't. I'm living proof of what's possible. So we're having this conversation to encourage you that if you're dealing with some stuff, and we all have stuff, if you do, don't be afraid to say, I need help. So with that being said, Dr. Ebony, so what are some things that men can do if they're dealing with these types of things?
I would definitely say find a safe support system, because we always talk about finding a support system, and we can have people around us who don't feel safe enough to disclose this stuff to. So find a safe support system that allows you to be human and allows you to experience a range of emotions. You can also kind of talk to mentors, start out asking around. I know common communal places that we like for women it may be the beauty salon or the nail shop, but the barber shop and things like that. Start to kind of get feelers for what people are doing to kind of help themselves. start trying to build that community where you feel like you can go to somebody. Also, let yourself off the hook. So this is internal work. Give yourself permission to be human. And one of the things that I know for certain is if you built your identity around those things, losing that is normal to feel depressed. And so giving yourself permission also means normalizing that it's okay to feel depressed and that we all feel depression. We all experience depression to some degree. And that doesn't mean that you are losing it. That doesn't mean that you're invaluable. That it doesn't mean that you're any less of a man. So I would invite people to do that internal work first and then start to build those community spaces where they can begin to kind of start the conversation around what's bothering them. Because to say go to therapy, like I'm always going to be an advocate for therapy, but I know that for therapy, some people just can't go. Some people need to be kind of like eased into it. And so building those trusting networks in the community could help you find it a little bit more easy to disclose to a stranger in therapy.
Yeah, and again, there are so many different things that can be done. Again, this whole network that I've created, Shattering the Stereotypes, is a resource for men who are courageous enough to say, you know, I need help. And on my website, you know, I've got courses and online things that give men some tools to start that process. Now, with that being said, I did want to touch on this because when I went through my depression, one of the most difficult things for me was figuring out how to find the right therapist. I remember looking through the phone book, and this tells you how long ago it's been. I'm looking through a phone book and I'm thinking to myself, how do I find a therapist? Do I have to have a Black therapist? What, I mean, all these things kind of going through my head, but I just knew I needed to get some help. That's the good news. So I was fortunate enough that I found a therapist who happened to be white, by the way, because there were no Black therapists in my area where I was living. And she was absolutely amazing. She was just absolutely perfect. So I do know that you can get help from someone who may not be Black. But I just want you to talk, what would you suggest to someone who's saying, you know, maybe I do need to find a therapist? What suggestions could you give?
Yeah, I do want to just validate that finding a therapist is hard. Like
Yes.
even as a psychologist, finding my own therapist is hard. I've gone through 3 or 4 in the past 2 years. So it's hard. So I just want to say that people don't email back until you got all that type of stuff happening. So don't feel discouraged. You have to just keep going. It's like dating almost. So I would say that right now, there is so much more information that we have available to us. We have directories that can help. So we have therapy for Black men. We have therapy for Black girls. And even if it says therapy for Black girls, does not mean that those providers on there don't work with men. So go on that directory as well and find a provider who's in your area or in the state where you are, and call them, email them, and ask them, are they willing to work with you around your issues? Because just because we're on a directory for women doesn't mean we don't serve other people, right? There's inclusivetherapist.com. So there's a number of organizations, therapy for people of color, that kind of thing. So there's a number of directories now that specifically are tailored towards finding somebody who looks like you, if you're wanting somebody who looks like you. If it doesn't matter, you want to use insurance, that kind of thing, you can go to psychologytoday.com as well and find the help. So also, if you work and you have insurance, you can also call your insurance company and have them pair you with somebody. So there are more options now that we have available to us than we had in the past. Absolutely.
Now, with that being said, you've created something that I think is really needed, and they're called therapy cards for men. So tell us a little bit about those.
So my therapy cards actually started out as a deck for women. So I initially created this resource for women. So this is how the initial deck looks. So my therapy cards for women, right? I saw when I got into private practice that there was a need for more professionals in this space. When I got to Austin, I was the only Black woman psychologist practicing in this city. And I was like, this doesn't sound quite right. This doesn't make any sense. So I started a small private practice that was supposed to be part-time. It literally just was supposed to be part-time. It filled up quickly. So I noticed that I can't see everybody. I don't accept insurance. Everybody can't pay what I'm asking. How do I help get more information out to people and help people feel like they're talking to me, talking to Dr. Ebony, doing some quality work without being able to access me? Because also we can only practice within the state that we're licensed. So if somebody in California, even though I'm licensed in California too, but if somebody in Ohio wanted to work with me, they couldn't because I'm not licensed in Ohio. So how do I help the woman who's reaching out to me in Ohio saying, I really want to talk to you. I like what you stand for. I like the information that you put out, and they can't. So I took all the questions that I commonly ask all of my clients and I put them in this card deck. From this card deck, we launched it in May of 2020, and I have to give it up for Black women. Black women said, Dr. Ebony, Black men need something too. And I was like, you know what? I would rather for us have something for ourselves first, but we're always going to help out the Black man. That I know. So I said, well, just give it a minute. And then I came up with the team deck. So this is for Black girls, right? And then I said, well, I was really reluctant because my work is around women and girls. So I was like, I can't keep having these people ask these questions and me leave the men out. So that's where the card deck for men came about. And so we recently launched the My Therapy cards for men in June. So that's actually in May. So that's where they came from. And it really is access. It's an access issue. It's an access issue. It's a cost issue. It's a stigma issue. So I wanted Black men to have something that they felt like they could easily access without it being so formal, without people having to know, because that vulnerability that I talked about earlier too, I was like, well, I think it does make sense if we already know that Black men have issues around vulnerability. Let's make it so that they can do some work too. I was like, okay, so this makes a lot of sense to create and expand this to men too, because this way they can do the work themselves. They can take it to their therapist. They can work with it with their homeboys. They can take it to the barbershop, wherever. They can work through it with their partner, wherever, and not feel so judged. And as people of color, I know we like cards. Many of us like cards. Not to say that all of us like cards, but we like cards. And so to put it in this form makes it a lot more attractive to people to be able to kind of like reach for them.
So tell us how they work. How do they work? What do you do?
Yeah, so my framework is that in order the healing that we go through, we address mindset, habits, and triggers. So the cards are categorized as such. You have your trigger category, you have your mindset category, and then you have your habit category. What I tell people is when they get the cards, go through all of the cards, put them in stacks of hard, medium, easy. Work through the easy card first, because if we're pulling, and it doesn't matter which category they are, if we're pulling the hard cards, we're going to be averse to it. We're not going to want to come back to it. Work through the easy cards, allow yourself the opportunity to see yourself be able to do the work, and that's going to increase your motivation to keep going. But there's no rhyme or reason. I do advise people to work through one card a week. There are 45 cards in this deck. There are 52 cards in the week. If we work through one card a week, give ourselves a break here and there, you have a resource you can use throughout the whole year. So one card a week, because you want to sit with this stuff. You don't want to just rush through it.
Yeah. Another problem we have in our society is this whole idea of this quick fix thing,
yes.
Instant gratification. Think that, okay, if I just do this, my life's going to be perfect.
Right.
It doesn't work that way. Transformation is a process.
Yes. It's
an ongoing process that we have to commit to. Now, with that being said, what are your thoughts about journaling?
Oh, I love journaling. I have journals to accompany the women's deck and the teen girls deck. I haven't created one for men yet because I'm not quite sure how that will be received. I think journaling is awesome. I think that is something about getting words from here, putting it on paper so you can see it. Is something about the process that writing that is cathartic. But I don't think journaling works for everyone. But I do think that getting it out of here, like even if you speak it into a recorder, even if you process it with a therapist, getting it from here and putting it out, whether it be words or writing, is so healing, so much healing in that process. So I absolutely love journaling.
Yeah, and I'm a huge advocate of journaling. When I first went to therapy, one of the first things that the therapist did, was she said when she wanted me to go home and just write down things I remembered from my childhood. She says, just write whatever comes to mind. And I wasn't a writer by any stretch of imagination, but again, I was committed to my growth. So I said, whatever it takes. So I go home and I started journaling. And as I started journaling, all these memories started coming up. And I started remembering different things, and things just kind of flowed. And all of a sudden I started making some connections to some of the trauma and abuse that I went through, and how it was still impacting my life. And it was just so transformative. And as I look back now, and I look at some of my initial journal entries, and I see the man that I am today, and I just go, wow,
Yeah.
because I can just see the transformation, the man that I've become as a result of my commitment to my own growth. So I'm a huge proponent of journaling. And yes, it's not for everyone, but trust me, if you're committed to it, it can be life-changing.
Life changing. Yeah.
So last question. What role does spirituality play in the healing process?
I think it can have a very tremendous and significant role. When you're going through healing, you need something that's going to ground you, because a lot of this unlearning, a lot of this revealing and digging deep and pulling out the pain in wounds, it can rock you as well. So if you don't have anything that grounds you, then it can also make this healing journey a lot more difficult. So I think spirituality, if you have something you can connect to and help you feel anchored, it can help you come back to yourself when you feel rocked by the things that are kind of unraveling, revealing themselves. So I think spirituality is huge for those people who kind of want to connect that way. And I invite it into my work. If that's something that you feel like would be helpful, let's do it. And so, when people don't have spiritual practices, we still do grounding work. So I see it all as grounding work.
Yeah. And again, we're not talking organized religion.
Right.
We're talking spirituality, connecting to something bigger than yourself. And you get to call it whatever you want to call it. But it is definitely something that can support you and actually carry you through some of the challenges as you go through this transformational process. Oh, but I did have one other question that I wanted to ask you. Make a distinction between coaching and therapy, because there's a gazillion different coaches out there today, and everybody's an expert. And, so can you make a distinction between coaching and therapy?
So quick and easy is that coaching is not a regulated field. Therapy is. Most of us have to go to school to become a therapist. Some of us who are therapists become coaches, but coaches don't have to go to school. Coaching is more of an experience type of thing, and coaching is more of a goal-oriented practice. Therapy is more of a healing. Both of them can be healing, but most of us as therapists, we're reaching back in your childhood to see earlier experiences, what has shaped who you are today. Coaching is really short-term, more goal-oriented, more solution-focused. And you really don't get into the weeds of, well, tell me what your mama did and why did she do that? And so all of that stuff can come out in coaching, but typically that's not the historical context of coaching. That's more the historical context of therapy. There's a lot of overlap. So you got to be careful with that. Like as a therapist, being a coach, there are some things in therapy I can't unlearn. So I can't be a life coach, because life coaching for me would mean that I would step into my therapy territory. So I have to be a food relationship coach, if that makes sense, because it's too muddied for me. But coaching is more goal focused, more oriented, more short term, but it can be long term. So I have it up on my website, actually, the difference between coaching and therapy.
Now, I will say this for me, and actually I started this before coaching was a thing. But I started off with the motivational stuff like Anthony Robbins and Les Brown and all of that. So I was in this mode of motivation. And motivation was really never my problem. But what I learned was, by going to therapy, I came to an understanding of why I was motivated. And I was motivated out of a deep sense of shame.
Yes.
I was motivated because I felt like I wasn't good enough, and by accomplishing stuff, then I would get people to like me. And I had this huge, insatiable need for other people's approval.
Right.
So for me, it wasn't until I went to therapy and started asking the deeper questions about what was driving my behavior. See, and that's what therapy does. It helps you understand what's driving you. Whereas coaching gives you some tools to move forward. I say therapy, which is more healing, has a bigger impact on your well-being and sense of inner peace. Because if you don't deal with your trauma and your stuff, coaching's not going to heal you. It's not going to heal you. So don't be afraid to go to therapy or whatever, but be willing to make peace with your past. And if I had to sum it up, that's the best way I can sum it up. Make peace with your past. If you remember beatings as a kid, if you remember trauma in your life and you haven't addressed that, I can assure you there's something that needs to be healed.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to heal that. You can heal it. I'm proof of it. You can heal it. But know that it's possible for you to move through all of that stuff and get to a life of joy. get to a life of passion and purpose. It's possible, but it takes effort. And so that's what this conversation is about, is letting you know that it's okay to do your work. Understand that it's really not about a destination. It's about a journey that you're going to be on. And that journey should be always moving to deeper and deeper levels of understanding who you are as a human being. And when you do that, life can work. And I know that's true. So now, Dr. Ebony, how can people find you if they want to work with you or learn more about your work?
Okay, yeah, and I have a session right now, so I want to give this out to the people quickly. I'm at drebony.com, and you can find me on social media across all platforms at Dr. Ebony Online. That's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I'm easy to find. If you want to find out more about the therapy cards, you can go to mytherapycards.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Dr. Ebony, for showing up. I really appreciate you. Love you for the work that you're doing, and glad we connect.
Thank you so much, Michael, for having me, and I'm happy to come back at any time.
All righty. Have a great day. Take care.
Thank you, Michael. You too.
All right. Bye-bye. So there you have it. Another episode of Shatter the Stereotypes. I appreciate you tuning in. Stay tuned for the next episode when I'm going to be talking to a comedian who's really amazing. You're going to love him. We'll see you next episode. Take care.